Skepticism was a philosophical tradition, sometimes organized into schools, but often much more casual than that, which arose in the generation of drastic cultural change after the death of Aristotle. It's more traditional to speak about the change in the Greek world after the death of Alexander in 323 BC, but the death of Aristotle the following year, 322 BCE, is much more important, of course, for the history of philosophy. Although it was looked at somewhat askance by Roman culture, skepticism continued to thrive under Roman rule, especially in the Eastern and Greek-speaking half of the empire. It was revived in modern times for the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment and remains a powerful stream of modern Western thought. The skeptics were trying to do what most philosophies have tried to do, that is, to find a secure basis for human happiness. The difference between the skeptics, their difference from the Greek philosophical schools preceding them, Sophism, Platonism, Aristotelianism, and from the new schools of Epicureanism and Stoicism that arose at about the same time skepticism did, was that the skeptics tried to ground the pursuit of happiness in a denial of knowledge rather than in the affirmation of one or another way to knowledge. The apparent founder of skepticism was Pyrrho of Elis, 365 or so to 275 BCE, a soldier attached to the staff of Alexander the Great on the long march to India, where he must have seen a world very different from the Hellenic normality of his own little mountainous polis of Elis in the Peloponnesus. Some speculate that Pyrrho may have communicated with Hindu wise men, and thus may have encountered a very different thought world, too. In any case, after Alexander's death in Babylon in 323, Pyrrho returned to Elis, his small native polis. Taking absolute skepticism to its logical conclusions, Pyrrho wrote nothing, which is ironic in a pleasant way, since his followers wrote book after book of Pyrrhonic hypotheses, Pyrrhonic sayings, Pyrrhonic this and that for some 5 centuries after his death. According to his disciples who did publish, Pyrrho taught that one must neither trust nor reject sense impressions nor any other kind of apparent knowledge. Apparently more reliable than varying sense impressions, a reason, to which most philosophers had had recourse before him, cannot, in fact, said Pyrrho, reach the inner substance of things. Whether as objects of rational inquiry or as items of sense data, things can be known to us only as they appear to one or another of our faculties. Now, since things appear differently to different observers, and indeed to the different faculties of one observer, and we can develop equally good arguments in favor of quite diverse descriptions or explanations of any apparent thing, we can be certain of nothing. And since we can be certain of nothing, it is wise to reserve judgment. Epichein is the word in Greek from which came the doctrine of epicheia, which means the withholding of judgment in scientific or in moral matters. A life of tranquil withdrawal was Pyrrho's ethical ideal, an ideal labeled ataraxia by Pyrrho's disciple Timon of Phlius, who wrote the first of the series of Pyrrhonic books about his master's sayings. The wise person, according to Pyrrho, will strive to reach and to keep his or her soul in such an ataraxic condition. It seems to have worked well enough for Pyrrho, who appears to have died at the then prodigious age of 90. What about human laws, customs, religious practices? The public liturgy is essential to the functioning of the polytheistic civil culture of the Greeks, or indeed of any of the other cultures of the ancient Mediterranean and West Asian and South Asian world at that time. How should a reflective person who is convinced of Pyrrhonic skepticism react to those liturgies of public life? Obey them, Pyrrho is said to have said. Stay out of trouble. Avoid scandal. Act decently in your community. Be decent. Timon, whom the Roman skeptic Sextus Empiricus called the apostle of the sayings of Pyrrho, or the prophet of the sayings of Pyrrho, somewhat the relationship of Paul to Jesus in the elaboration of Christian teaching, spiced up this first book of the skeptical tradition with satires of the other philosophers of the time, except, of course, for Pyrrho and also for Xenophon, interestingly enough. Pyrrho's followers spread his oral teachings widely indeed. A sign of their appeal to the contemporary Greek mentality is the fact that Plato's school of advanced study, the Academy at Athens, was dominated by fairly extreme forms of skeptical philosophy from the early 3rd century to the early 1st century BCE. Arcesilaus, 314-241 BCE, who became the director of the Academy less than a century after its foundation by Plato in 369, is generally described as the founder of the Second or Middle Academy. Actually, the Academy remained in continuous legal existence as a continuous institution until 529 CE, when the Emperor Justinian, the Christian Roman Emperor Justinian, closed it for reasons fiscal as well as doctrinal. An extraordinarily long duration during which it went through many different phases of attachment to one or another philosophical mode, one or another philosophical affirmation. Now, Arcesilaus, who became the head of the Academy and turned it into its second or middle stage, is supposed to have said that he was not even certain that he was uncertain, thus going Socrates once better, since Socrates at least knew that he did not know anything. Arcesilaus was particularly critical of Stoic thought. We may wonder why, but I think a good reason comes from Stoicism's own awkward being caught in its commitment both to a material view of ultimate reality, including God, who for the Stoics was a material reality, and an overarchingly spiritual set of moral imperatives. Arcesilaus wanted to do to Stoicism what Socrates had done so devastatingly to Sophism. Unfortunately, for the skeptical tradition, he was far less successful. It's important to recognize, I think, that Arcesilaus, although he broke with Plato's own line of thought on many, many matters, tried to be true to the tradition and trying to reincarnate, so to speak, not literally, but intellectually, to re-embody the style of Socrates' teaching and, as far as he thought, the content of it as well. Consistent with Pyrrho's denial of knowledge was Arcesilaus' exploration of human subjectivity. And here again we can see the sophist tradition against which Socrates reacted. The sophist tradition which forgets objective analysis, forgets the search for objective truth, and explores the subjective reality of the human experience. No sense impression, according to Arcesilaus, no sense impression we receive or no statement we make about any external object has any guarantee of validity. Why? Because we can be firmly convinced subjectively of something which others see to be objectively false. We can be firmly convinced subjectively of something which others can see to be objectively false, or which we in time will also come to see as objectively false. Now, of course, the criticism of this criticism of objectivity, the criticism launched by Stoics responding to Arcesilaus, was that the skeptics themselves had undercut the notion that any kind of objective certainty exists. The skeptics denied this. Much as they accused their opponents of circular reasoning, they got caught in lots of coils of circularity themselves. The so-called Third or New Academy was founded by Carneades, 213 to about 128 BCE. He maintained the Middle Academy's attack on Stoicism, although less fiercely. In one case, for example, he went on an embassy from the Athenian city-state to Rome in the company of the Stoic philosopher Diogenes, and apparently they got along quite amicably. Carneades taught that knowledge is impossible, and this he goes really beyond the Middle Academy. Humans have no criterion of proof. Any proof rests on assumptions that must be proved in turn. Carneades went so far as to argue that any scientific statement based on sense data could be contradicted with equal validity by a statement from the realm of dreams, visions, hallucinations, and so on. And the effort of Stoics or others to resolve the dispute between the scientific affirmation and the hallucinatory affirmation was doomed because as the Stoics themselves conceded, rational arguments consist of concepts which are based on what? Based on human experience. So we come back with all of these Stoic arguments to the primacy of human experience, which can never be verified from outside in any kind of durable or transmissible kind of way. But since the conduct of human life makes complete suspension of judgment of this sort absolutely impossible, Carneades developed standards of probability which allow us to act in the world. You can go off and be a hermit if you want. If you want to be a consistent skeptic, you can be either silent in terms of written teaching like Pyrrho, or you can become a hermit of an Indian or then a later Christian type. But you can't very well be an active citizen of the world. And the skeptics were too Greek, many of them too Athenian to imagine a life being anything else. So Carneades affirmed that we can never attain scientific truth, not to mention ethical truth, but we should keep trying nonetheless. And we should maintain and conform to the ethical standards of our community, whatever it and its standards may be. In theology, the skeptics tended to atheism. They are certainly not moral relativists, or they are moral relativists, since any kind of moral pattern is acceptable, but you have to adhere to it. You do not have the liberty of prescinding from the morality of your own community. But when talking about the gods, the skeptics tended to atheism. They argued, if there is any kind of divine providence, how can we explain such facts as poisonous snakes? Now, of course, such facts have to be apparent facts, but if someone thinks that a snake is poisonous and has just bitten him and is about to kill him, then this is a reality for that person, certainly, and thus an entirely valid reality in the world of impressions. Carneades was especially critical of Stoic ideas about divine law, which presumably had to emanate from some kind of consistent divine justice. Cicero disapproved of this skeptical critique, even though he was initially attracted to other aspects of skeptical teaching. But natural law was too important to his Roman sensibility for him to go along this far with the Middle Academy. Now, the most complete and most durably influential of skepticism's teachers, because his book survived better than anybody else's, was a medical doctor known as Sextus Empiricus, a Roman, who may have lived about CE 200, although some scholars think he lived about 50 years later. Sextus practiced medicine in Rome, and 3 of his books survive, thanks to Latin translations of them done later. He wrote them in Greek, which may seem a kind of alienating thing to do if you're living in Rome, but we should remember that the Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote his personal meditations in Greek rather than in Latin. Sextus's Roman voice represents a second wave of skepticism, which arose from a re-examination of the early Pyrrhonic tradition after the end of the Third Academy, which died in the 1st century BCE when the Academy as a whole rejected skepticism for dogmatic philosophy. The fact that we're so unsure of the dates of Sextus Empiricus is revealing in itself. It suggests, for one thing, that he was far from the center of Greco-Roman intellectual life despite his residence at Rome, which had become a welcoming center for philosophical schools as early as the days of the Scipionic Circle in the 2nd century BCE. Roman skepticism, in other words, seems to have been somewhat peripheral, estranged from the established intelligentsia of the empire. Besides, the Roman state was entering its second long spasm of civil wars, which would last this time from the year 235 to 284 when the Emperor Diocletian took over. Cicero, to be sure, had made his well-remembered and much-copied contributions during the earlier and longer period of civil strife in the 1st century BCE, but his synthetic eclecticism retained little of his early interest in skepticism. By contrast, Sextus tried to be a pure Pyrrhonist in the Greek style of philosophical orthodoxy, not to allow that tradition to be combined with, in his mind, to be contaminated by elements of Stoicism, Epicureanism, Aristotelianism, as Cicero had not only allowed and not only permitted himself, but had strongly encouraged that one do. The epithet Empiricus was awarded to Sextus because he believed that the closest we can come to a criterion of truth is experience, empyreia in Greek. This is not new. This is the old skeptic doctrine from the very beginning. But he seemed to copiers of his works to embody that doctrine with particular clarity, to push it to the forefront of the whole skeptical critique of other schools of thought. Now, any science based on reason or logic, said Sextus Empiricus, is not to be trusted. Widely attested experience is our surest guide to probability, Carneades' kind of probability. Knowledge we can't have, certainty we can't have, but probability we can find if we get enough data together. Carneades said, and Sextus Empiricus repeated strongly after him, that the way to build up a sense of the probability of our impressions is to mass them together. If, for example, we see in the milling crowd of the Agora a person, a friend of ours, or someone who appears to be a friend of ours, but we're not quite sure that he is, then we should approach him, listen to his voice, see his mannerisms, his body language, and if all of those correspond to what we know of our friend, then we can be convinced that our initial impression is probable. If, of course, he pulls out his driver's license or a ranking credit card, we in modern society would be absolutely secure in our notion that A probably is A rather than some B who simply appears to be A. Okay. Sextus wrote 3 books called The Outlines of Pyrrhonism, Against the Mathematicians, a not very adequate title, and thirdly, Against the Academics, or as some prefer to call it, Against the Professors. His first book, The Outlines of Pyrrhonism, in which he tries to go back to the pure tradition, dedicates the first of the 3 books of which it is composed in turn to presenting the case for skepticism. In the following 2 books of that first book, Sextus attacks other schools of thought, which he calls, in the long tradition, dogmatic. Sextus's second book, which is often, though inadequately entitled Against the Mathematicians, breaks down dogmatic philosophy by categories rather than by schools. That is, into issues supposedly resolved by logic, by physical science, or by ethics. In the first part of this book, he attacks Stoic logic with particular force. Both there and in the Outlines of Pyrrhonism, Sextus attacks syllogistic reasoning. He says that syllogisms are hopelessly circular. They require the major premise, the first of their classic 3 statements, to acknowledge the claim of the concluding statement. 19th century philosophers like John Stuart Mill would resume that attack. Sextus also attacks causal reasoning. He said, if A is said to be the cause of B, A and B cannot exist at the same time because then B could be the cause of A. A cannot exist before and without B because a thing is only the cause of another thing by virtue of its relationship to it. And thirdly, A cannot exist after B and be its cause for obvious reasons. If this critique can be criticized by us as lacking in what we consider common sense, it nevertheless made clever use of the rules of logic developed by the Stoics. Sextus attacks divine providence much as Carneades did, exploring the gruesome consequences of the fact of the existence of evil in a world supposedly supervised by a good, infinite, and impartial God. His argument takes Carneades' argument and expands it somewhat in this fashion. Back to the poisonous snakes. If there is a divine providence, Sextus said, that providence must be not only infinitely good and infinitely wise and consistent, it must also, in its consistency, be impartial. Now, we all know that poisonous snakes bite some people and kill them and do not bite others, or if they bite them, sometimes the bite is not fatal. How is this possible if there is a providence of the kind we've described? Benign, good, infinite, and entirely impartial to all. Maybe there is a providence which is sympathetic to some and unsympathetic to others, but if that is the case, then it cannot be just. It cannot be impartially just at any rate. In a way, Sextus is kind of imagining here in advance the doctrine of predestination, which will be so important for a Christianity shaped by the philosophical reasoning of these Greek schools. The doctrine of predestination launched by Paul, the prophet or the apostle of the words of Jesus, and formulated by Augustine, who is affected by the skeptics, not in doctrine, but in generic form, in mode of argument. If there is something like this sort of predestinative providence, which many later Christians will maintain, then there is no providence at all, because the existence of such a thing is inconsistent with our definition of God. In his third book, Against the Academics, some prefer to translate the Greek title as Against the Professors, Sextus criticizes teachers of grammar, rhetoric, geometry, arithmetic, astrology, and music. He certainly had minimum respect for the traditional value of traditional education, an attitude which would, interestingly enough, be echoed by St. Augustine when he was newly converted to Christianity, a Christianity certainly not skeptical, in his own early dialogue against the academics. And in Sextus's hands, that title, Against the Academics, also lets us know that the academy, which had been the great stronghold of skeptical thought for the period from Arcesilaus to the end of the 1st century BCE, was now the enemy. Very dogmatic, and at this point was returning to a kind of recovery of Platonism, which we call, reasonably enough, Neoplatonism. As regards daily life, daily happiness, the fundamental goal of any of these philosophical schools, Sextus Empiricus maintained the teaching of the earlier Pyrrhonists. We should trust all perceptions equally, ours and others, other people's as well. We must respect current laws and customs. Any kind of convention, unless it does extreme violence to what appears to us to be a necessary affirmation itself. That's a complicated issue right there. Should skeptics become martyrs like Socrates or not? The skeptical tradition wants to recover Socrates' kind of purity, and it's possible that there are grounds for a kind of skeptical martyrdom, although this is not clear from the text of Sextus's own writings themselves. But it's an issue which empiricism is going to have to face in later centuries, in later revivals. We should respond to our natural instincts and to our apparent needs, and we must keep pursuing scientific truth even though it is unattainable. Intellectual virtue lies in that seeking, in that quest. Now, the central issue, endlessly raised by skepticism, is pretty central to any thinking person. How do we know? Logic, I think eventually one has to admit, is culture-bound, always culture-bound, despite the strenuous efforts on the part of Aristotle or later on of the 15th century logicians to free logic of such assumptions. And hence, it is not a sufficiently reliable method for ascertaining truth. So what can we trust? And practical experience is the skeptic's answer. For many centuries now, intellectuals interested in science have hoped that if the scientific enquiry of physical nature could become sufficiently empirical, it could be our best guide to certitude, or at least to probability. And hence the early modern effort to establish an empirical scientific method. This cast of mind had great influence on the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and it continues to affect the attitude of laboratory science to the present day. What does the standard high school science teacher inculcate into his or her students very early on in the course in chemistry, biology, not to mention physics? That there is an empirical standard by which we can judge reality. Science is not simply a clash of theories. Science gives empirical certitude, indeed certain knowledge. This, I think, is the core of the tremendous dispute right now between evolutionists and creationists. Evolutionists tend to insist that evolution is clearly the case. Creationists insist that it is not, and that the account given in the book of Genesis is the case. Insofar as evolutionary scientists are willing to admit that evolution is a theory too, well, evolution is a theory, and the theory of the book of Genesis is a theory, and we have to look for a greater probability as we examine these two theories, then the dispute tends to be resolvable. But unless one is willing to abandon what we have attached to the word skepticism, a claim of its capacity to give us absolute and lasting knowledge, then we are caught in a very difficult kind of problem. Unfortunately, starting with that very movement of the scientific revolution, human experience has been having a hard time of it for the last 4 centuries. Modern science has shown us that very little of our experience is accurate. For example, the sun does not rise in the east of a flat earth and set in the west, which would be evidently the case if we simply judge from our experience. Greek cosmologists were able to decide that the earth was round on the basis of geometrical reasoning. Some skeptics accepted that doctrine because they argued that the geometrical theorems which established the roundness of the globe were themselves conducive to probability, although of course not finally conducive to certain knowledge. We would have to say that we don't really have certain knowledge of the globality of the globe until the day of the space photography, when a photograph can show us that the globe is actually round, though a true skeptic would continue to maintain that what we have here is an impression. And while this impression should be trusted because of other kinds of probability evidence, still it is not absolutely certain. When we got down to the matter, the basic problem, the skeptics tended to be kind of atomic. They tended to be influenced by Democritus, who argued that all reality was made up of atoms, little units that could not be cut down any further. The very word atomos means something that can't be cut any further. Atomic reality, atomic material reality, has been broken down over and over and over again, and now what we are told is the ultimate particle, the quark, is accessible to us only through ultra-abstract mathematics. which seem to anyone who is not quite an advanced mathematician simply an impression, which may or may not combine with other impressions to give us something approaching probability. And on and on and on. Science, modern science, ironically enough, has not encouraged our belief in average human experience, normal human experience. So why has empiricism seemed such an attractive mental habit to the modern West? But attractive it has certainly been, whatever the reason. David Hume, the great 18th century Scottish thinker, was extremely attracted by skeptical argument and made a great deal of the skeptical attacks upon Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, or Epicurean modes of proof. Epicureans offer less in the way of proof, of course, than those other three schools, but they still offer some of it. John Stuart Mill, in the 19th century, was particularly interested by Sextus Empiricus' attack upon the syllogism, and he extended it. He also tried to solve the problem about divine providence, since he wanted to be a believer in God in a kind of very free-form latitudinarian Christianity. And he came up with a fascinating notion that God is in fact limited, and that what we are supposed to do morally is to collaborate with God in achieving the goals of the sort of providence that God would like but cannot quite enforce. An interesting idea indeed. And one could even argue, I think, that the deconstructionists of the late 20th century, the great French school of Derrida, of Lacan, of Foucault, and so on, are the skeptics of our age. In their deconstruction, they take apart all of the normal arguments for objective reality, leaving highly refined analysis of the impressions we receive is the surest guides to any kind of valid statement. It seems to me that they represent the third or the fourth revival, or the fifth revival, if you wish, of the Pyrrhonic tradition, which has had so much to do with the way in which the West has moved, despite the deep disapproval of it, which the Romans were the first to register.